What is the moral principle underlying our approach to the equality between human beings? Right? We think about equal rights and human rights, and we apply them consistently across human beings. And the reason that we have a conception of human rights is because we recognize that somebody's moral value should not be dependent on morally irrelevant concepts like race and gender and sexuality and religion. So what is it that gives us that? Is our equal treatment of human beings due to an equality within the human beings? Well, of course not. Human beings aren't equal, they're not the same. We all have different skin colors and cultures and proportions and eye shapes and all sorts of things, right? But to be anti-racist isn't to deny that these differences exist. To be anti-racist is to say that we recognize these differences, but we recognize that they're not morally relevant differences. Just as the anti-racist recognizes the difference between the races, but says that it doesn't make any moral difference to the way that we should consider them in our ethical framework, so does the refusal to exploit animals entail recognizing the differences that we share with these animals, but only taking them into account when they're actually morally relevant. If you find the trait that you think it is that differentiates a human being from a non-human animal, that justifies the difference in treatment, the logic would have to work as such. You would have to find the trait, the characteristic that those non-human animals don't have, that if a human being were to also not have, we treat that human being like we treat the animal. So let's say that the reason why we justify torturing pigs is because they don't have a similar sense of self-awareness that we do. Okay, if that's your reason, then let's apply it consistently. Take a human being and take away their self-awareness, but they can still feel pain. Take a severely disabled child who just doesn't have the self-awareness, or has the same level of self-awareness as a pig. Are you okay with torturing them? I would submit not. I mean, maybe you do. But whichever you choose, you're either left with this repugnant conclusion that we should carelessly torture the disabled or the elderly or the most vulnerable of our society, or if you go the other way, you're left with the inconvenient conclusion that animal exploitation has to end now as a matter of principle, just as racism does, just as sexism does, just as ableism does, too. You don't need to see them as equal. That's the point that I'm trying to first get across to you. It's not about pigs versus humans, it's about pigs versus human taste buds. And no serious moral analysis can really think that those are even comparable. If you refuse to partake in the exploitation of non-human animals, your stomach, your fridge, your mind, and your ethics will have never felt cleaner. If you turn down the offer of milk in your coffee and aren't afraid to say why, then your moral courage will betray a level of empathy far exceeding most of those around you, but exactly in line with what those beings that we share this planet with deserve. If you recognize your place in this world not as the unrestricted owner of animals, but an animal yourself, whose will to live and avoid suffering is mirrored in those who populate the factory farms, you'll have no choice but to stop eating them and their products. Not because you begrudgingly feel that you have to in order to accord with your rational moral system, but because if you spend even a moment thinking about this seriously, you'll want to, and you'll be a better person for it. As Darwin movingly observes at the end of The Origin of Species, there is grandeur in this view of life, recognizing our position in the animal kingdom and where and how that should prescribe us to treat other animals too. Don't consider it a problematic hurdle and a struggle to overcome, but the opportunity to be part of the greatest social justice movement that the world has ever known. As Peter Singer asks, when history looks back, do you want to be counted among the oppressors or among the liberators? You've got to make that choice. Again, as our last speaker said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I think we can all agree that this is accurate, but I can offer another corollary to that point, which is that extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification. And we don't even have measly evidence, not even a shred of it, even for the most basic mistreatment of animals that we currently partake in. Okay, if you pride yourself on rationalism, Pride yourself on refusing to leave out any sentient creature from your rational moral code. This is not difficult ethical philosophy. Does it get more basic in the consideration of our ethical conduct than to suggest that perhaps it's not a good idea to cause unnecessary suffering where it could be avoided, especially when the justification for this suffering is as trivial as sensory pleasure? Does it get more elementary than to oppose the torture of innocent creatures? The torture of innocent creatures. We don't justify torture. We don't justify the torture of our enemies, even when we have a good reason to do it. How can we possibly justify the torture of innocent creatures? For no other reason than our own moral weakness. And so you can ask all you like, how dare I force my views on you? Well, it's a good question, but how about this? I'll cut you a deal, okay? I'll stop shoving these inconvenient, let's say, moral considerations down your throat. When you stop shoving the tortured corpses of the innocent down the same hole, right? I'll stop caging you into difficult conversations. When you stop paying for people to cage innocent beings into factory farms. I will stop preaching, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, about the torture of animals when the torture ceases to exist. I'm sorry if you don't like it, I truly am, but you're really going to have to get used to it, okay? I won't stop making people aware of what's going on, and I won't pretend like your convenience is a legitimate excuse for this moral crisis. I will ruin the party every time. Let me be clear about this. If you do contribute to this unnecessary industry, then I hate what you're doing. But I don't hate you. I think highly enough of you to suggest that you can do better. All right? You have the capacity to reach the moral standard that your intelligence prescribes. You have the potential here to be a moral example, every one of whom makes it slightly easier for the next person to follow in their footsteps. Just ask yourself, on what other moral issue would you permit the same excuses that we allow on the issue of animal rights? Taste, pleasure, and convenience, and societal disruption. On what other issues would we allow these kinds of responses to even be taken seriously? This isn't some kind of philosophical fancy or fun exercise in argumentation. This is the single greatest moral emergency of our time. Rid yourself of the superstition of human exceptionalism, of the myth of justified torture. Future generations will define you morally by which side of this issue